As I walked into the Summit Solutions boardroom that Tuesday morning, Ryan Thompson's confident smile froze on his face. The man who had thrown me under the bus 6 months earlier to protect his precious reputation was now staring at me in complete disbelief. Today, as the new HR director for Pinnacle Consulting Group, I was here to announce our acquisition of his failing company. The same company where he'd orchestrated my termination to hide our relationship was now mine to restructure. And the first order of business, a complete review of all personnel decisions made in the past year, starting with my own wrongful termination case. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The glass towers of downtown Austin gleamed in the morning sunlight as Jessica Martinez pulled into the parking garage of Summit Solutions Inc. It was a routine Tuesday in March, but something felt different about this particular day. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but there was an electricity in the air that made her think significant changes were coming. As the senior marketing manager for one of Austin's most prestigious digital marketing agencies, Jessica had learned to trust her instincts about shifts in corporate energy. Those instincts had served her well over the past 8 years, helping her climb from a century-level marketing coordinator to one of the company's most respected campaign leaders. The elevator ride to the 12th floor gave her a moment to review her packed schedule. 3 client presentations, a strategy meeting with the creative team, and the quarterly budget review that everyone had been dreading. Summit Solutions had been struggling lately, losing 3 major clients in the past 6 months to newer, more agile competitors. The whispers around the office suggested that major changes were coming from the top, though nobody seemed to know exactly what form those changes might take. Jessica's corner office reflected her success within the company. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the Austin skyline, while the walls displayed framed campaigns that had won industry awards and saved struggling client accounts. Her desk was organized with military precision, every document in its place, every project timeline color-coded and tracked. This attention to detail had made her indispensable to Summit's leadership team and had earned her a reputation as someone who could deliver results under impossible deadlines. The morning started like any other, with Jessica reviewing campaign metrics and preparing for her first client call. But everything changed when Ryan Thompson appeared in her doorway. The VP of Sales commanded attention wherever he went, with his perfectly styled dark hair, expensive suits, and the kind of charismatic smile that had made him Summit's top revenue generator for 3 consecutive years. At 35, Ryan had climbed the corporate ladder faster than anyone in company history, and his relationship with CEO Robert Hayes had made him virtually untouchable within the organization. "Good morning, superstar," Ryan said, leaning against her doorframe with the casual confidence that had first caught Jessica's attention months earlier. "Ready for another day of making the rest of us look bad with your brilliant campaign?" Jessica looked up from her computer screen, unable to suppress the smile that always seemed to appear when Ryan was around. Their relationship had evolved from professional respect to something much more complicated over the past 8 months, though they'd managed to keep things discreet enough that the office gossip mill hadn't picked up on it yet. The chemistry between them was undeniable, but both understood the delicate nature of workplace relationships, especially given their different positions within the company hierarchy. "Flattery will get you everywhere, Thompson," she replied, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. "What brings you to my humble corner of the empire this morning? Don't tell me the sales team needs another miracle campaign to save a client you oversold to." Ryan stepped into her office and closed the door behind him, a gesture that immediately shifted the energy in the room from playful banter to something more serious. Jessica had learned to read his moods over the months they'd been seeing each other, and something in his expression suggested this wasn't going to be a typical morning check-in between colleagues who happened to be secretly dating. "Actually, I wanted to talk to you about something important," Ryan said, settling into the chair and running a hand through his hair in the nervous gesture Jessica had come to recognize. "There's been some talk upstairs about reorganizing the leadership structure, and I think there might be some opportunities for both of us to advance our positions significantly." The conversation that followed would later seem like a perfect example of dramatic irony, though Jessica wouldn't recognize it until much later. Ryan spoke enthusiastically about his vision for their future at Summit Solutions, painting a picture of professional partnership that could elevate both their careers to new heights. He talked about the campaigns they could develop together, the clients they could win, and the influence they could wield as a power couple within Austin's competitive digital marketing landscape. Jessica found herself caught up in his enthusiasm, imagining a future where their personal and professional lives could finally be integrated openly. The secrecy of their relationship had been weighing on her more heavily in recent weeks, especially as their feelings for each other had deepened beyond what either had initially expected. The idea of being able to acknowledge their partnership publicly, to work together officially instead of stealing moments between meetings and fabricating reasons to collaborate, felt like a dream finally within. "I've been thinking about this a lot lately," Jessica admitted, her guard dropping as she allowed herself to be vulnerable with him. "Hiding what we have feels increasingly dishonest, not just to ourselves but to everyone around us. If we're serious about building something together, both personally and professionally, maybe it's time to be transparent about our relationship." Ryan's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, and Jessica caught a flicker of something that might have been panic before he quickly masked it with his trademark charming smile. In that split second, she glimpsed a side of him that she'd never seen before, a calculation behind his eyes that suggested his thoughts were moving in directions she hadn't anticipated. "Well, let's not get ahead of ourselves," Ryan said carefully, his tone becoming more measured. "There are a lot of variables to consider, especially with all the uncertainty around here lately. We need to be strategic about how we handle this, make sure we're positioning ourselves for maximum advantage when the dust settles." The shift in his language from emotional to strategic should have been a warning sign, but Jessica was too invested in the vision he'd painted to notice the change immediately. She continued to share her thoughts about their future together, unaware that Ryan was already calculating how their relationship might impact his own advancement opportunities within the company's changing landscape. Their conversation was interrupted by a knock on Jessica's office door, followed by the appearance of Amanda Chen, Summit's finance director and Jessica's closest friend within the company. Amanda's expression was unusually serious as she stepped into the office, glancing between Jessica and Ryan with the kind of pointed look that suggested she had something important to discuss but wasn't sure whether Ryan should be present for the conversation. "Sorry to interrupt," Amanda said, her voice carrying a professional tone that Jessica recognized as her friend's way of signaling urgency without alarming anyone who might be listening. "Jessica, could I speak with you about the quarterly budget projections when you have a moment? There are some discrepancies in the client retention forecasts that need immediate attention." Ryan stood immediately, seeming almost relieved to have an excuse to end their conversation. "I should get going anyway," he said, checking his expensive watch with an air of importance. "Big client call with the Dallas account in 20 minutes. Jessica, let's continue our discussion later, maybe over dinner tonight?" After Ryan left, Amanda closed the office door and turned to Jessica with an expression of concern that made Jessica's stomach tighten with apprehension. Amanda had been her friend since Jessica's first week at Summit Solutions, and over the years they'd developed the kind of professional relationship that allowed them to communicate entire conversations with just a look. "We need to talk," Amanda said without preamble, settling into the chair that Ryan had just vacated. "I've been hearing some disturbing rumors from the executive floor, and I think you need to know what's being said before you get blindsided." Jessica felt a chill run down her spine despite the warm Austin sunshine streaming through her office window. Amanda's serious tone and the way she kept glancing at the door suggested that whatever she was about to share was sensitive enough to potentially damage careers if overheard by the wrong people. "What kind of rumor?" Jessica asked, though part of her already suspected that whatever Amanda was about to tell her would somehow involve Ryan and the relationship they'd been so careful to keep private. Amanda leaned forward, lowering her voice to barely above a whisper. "There's talk about a major reorganization coming down from Robert Hayes, something that goes way beyond the usual shuffling of department budget. Word is that several senior positions are going to be eliminated or drastically restructured, and there's going to be a much closer examination of personal relationships within the company, especially anything that might create conflicts of interest or liability issues." The implications of Amanda's words hit Jessica like a physical blow. Summit Solutions had always maintained strict policies about workplace relationships, requiring disclosure and approval from HR for any romantic involvement between employees at different levels of the corporate hierarchy. Jessica and Ryan had discussed the policy early in their relationship, agreeing that they would handle the disclosure process when they felt ready to make their relationship official. That conversation now seemed naive in retrospect, as Jessica began to understand the precarious position their secrecy had created. "How specific are these rumors?" Jessica asked, trying to keep her voice steady despite the growing anxiety that was making it difficult to think clearly. "Are we talking about general policy enforcement, or is there something more targeted happening?" Amanda's expression grew even more serious, and she glanced at the door again before responding. "Lisa Parker in HR has been asking very specific questions about certain employees, including detailed reviews of expense reports, travel records, and meeting schedules. She's also been pulling security badge data to track employee movements after hours and on weekends." "Jessica, this isn't random policy enforcement. Someone is building cases against specific people, and I'm worried that you might be one of the targets." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Amanda sharing fragments of information she'd gathered from various sources throughout the company. The picture that emerged was of a systematic investigation into potential policy violations, led by HR Director Lisa Parker under direct orders from CEO Robert Hayes. The investigation appeared to be focused on senior-level employees, whose personal relationships might create conflicts of interest or expose the company to potential harassment lawsuits. As Amanda spoke, Jessica found herself remembering dozens of small details from recent weeks that suddenly took on new significance. Ryan's increasing nervousness about being seen together in the office, his reluctance to attend company events where they might naturally interact, and his insistence on meeting at locations far from Summit's headquarters all now seemed like potential evidence of guilt rather than romantic discretion. The most troubling revelation came when Amanda mentioned that Lisa Parker had been spending considerable time reviewing the expense reports and travel records for Ryan's department, paying particular attention to any instances where his expenses overlapped with those of other employees. Jessica's heart sank as she realized that their weekend trips to Dallas, Houston, and San Antonio, which they'd carefully planned to look like separate business travel, might actually have created a paper trail that would be impossible to explain away if scrutinized closely. "Amanda, I need you to be completely honest with me." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Jessica said, her voice barely steady. "Do you think Ryan knows about this investigation? Is there any chance he's been feeding information to protect himself?" The question hung in the air between them like a toxic cloud, poisoning the atmosphere of trust and friendship that had always characterized their relationship. Amanda's hesitation before answering told Jessica everything she needed to know, even before her friend spoke the words that would shatter her faith in the man she'd fallen in love with. "I don't want to believe it," Amanda said slowly, "but there have been some inconsistencies in how information is flowing through the company. Details that should have stayed confidential are somehow reaching the wrong people, and the timing suggests that someone with access to senior-level discussions is sharing information selectively. I can't prove anything, but Ryan has been spending a lot of time in private meetings with Robert Hayes lately, meetings that don't appear on any official calendar." The rest of Jessica's day passed in a blur of mounting anxiety and growing suspicion. Every interaction with colleagues felt potentially loaded with hidden meaning. Every glance from the executive floor seemed to carry the weight of judgment and evaluation. She found herself analyzing her relationship with Ryan through the lens of corporate politics, searching for signs that he might have been playing a longer game than she'd realized. By the time evening arrived, Jessica had worked herself into a state of barely controlled panic about the implications of Amanda's revelation. When Ryan texted to suggest dinner at their usual spot, the upscale restaurant in the Domain where they'd shared so many intimate conversations about their future together, Jessica felt a mixture of desperation and dread about the conversation they needed to have. The restaurant was crowded with Austin's professional elite, the kind of ambitious young executives and entrepreneurs who'd transformed the city into a major tech hub over the past decade. Jessica arrived first and chose a corner table where they could speak privately, without being overheard by colleagues or competitors who might recognize them. When Ryan arrived 15 minutes later, Looking characteristically confident in his perfectly tailored suit and expensive watch, Jessica felt her heart break a little at how much she still cared for him despite her growing suspicions about his loyalty. "You look beautiful," Ryan said as he settled into the chair across from her, reaching across the table to squeeze her hand in the gesture of affection that had always made her feel like the center of his world. "I've been thinking about our conversation this morning, and I have some ideas about how we can position ourselves for the changes that are coming." Jessica pulled her hand away gently, steeling herself for the confrontation she'd been dreading all day. "Ryan, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Are you aware of any HR investigation involving workplace relationships? Specifically, any investigation that might involve us?" The change in Ryan's expression was subtle but unmistakable. The confident smile faltered for just a moment, replaced by something that looked like carefully controlled panic before he quickly reassembled his charming facade. In that brief moment of vulnerability, Jessica saw the truth that would change everything between them forever. "Why would you ask something like that?" Ryan said, his voice taking on a defensive tone that Jessica had never heard from him before. "Has someone been spreading rumors about us? Because if they have, we need to address it immediately before it gets out of hand." The evasiveness of his response confirmed Jessica's worst fears about the direction their relationship was heading. Instead of the honest conversation she'd hoped for, Ryan was already positioning himself to control the narrative and minimize his own exposure to potential consequences. The man she'd fallen in love with was revealing himself to be someone entirely different from the person she'd believed him to be. "Amanda heard some things today that suggest there's a systematic investigation into potential policy violations," Jessica said, watching Ryan's face carefully for any sign of recognition or guilt. "She thinks someone has been providing information to HR about specific employees, helping to build cases against people who might be in violation of company policies." Ryan's reaction to this information was everything Jessica needed to know about where his loyalties truly lay. Instead of concern for her welfare, or anger about the invasion of their privacy, she saw calculation in his eyes as he quickly assessed the potential damage to his own career prospects. The silence that followed her revelation stretched uncomfortably as Ryan appeared to be weighing his options and considering his response strategy. When he finally spoke, his words confirmed Jessica's worst fears about the man she'd trusted with her heart and her career. "Jessica, I think we need to be very careful about how we handle this situation. If there really is an investigation happening, we need to make sure we're not creating any additional problems for ourselves. Maybe it would be best if we stepped back from our personal relationship until this all blows over." The casual way he suggested abandoning their relationship to protect his own interests felt like a physical slap to Jessica. The future they'd discussed that very morning, the dreams of professional and personal partnership that had sustained her through months of secrecy and uncertainty, were being discarded as easily as a failed marketing campaign that no longer served the company's needs. "Are you saying you want to break up with me to avoid potential HR problems?" Jessica asked, her voice barely above a whisper as the full magnitude of his betrayal began to sink in. "I'm saying we need to be realistic about our priorities," Ryan replied, his tone becoming increasingly cold and businesslike. "We both have careers to protect, and if continuing our relationship puts those careers at risk, then maybe we need to reevaluate what's really important here." The conversation that followed would replay in Jessica's mind countless times over the coming months, each word etched into her memory with painful clarity. Ryan spoke about their relationship as if it had been nothing more than a strategic alliance, a temporary arrangement that had served its purpose but was now becoming a liability that needed to be eliminated. The love and intimacy they'd shared, the dreams they'd built together and the trust she'd placed in him, were all reduced to collateral damage in his personal ambition. As Jessica sat across from the man she'd thought she loved, watching him systematically dismantle everything meaningful between them to protect his own interests, she began to understand that she'd never really known Ryan Thompson at all. The charming, supportive partner who'd encouraged her dreams and shared her vision for the future had been an elaborate performance, carefully calibrated to secure her loyalty and cooperation while he advanced his own agenda. The betrayal felt like drowning in plain sight, suffocating on the realization that the person she'd trusted most in the world had been preparing to sacrifice her career and reputation to save his own. As Ryan continued to speak about damage control and strategic positioning, Jessica felt something fundamental shift inside her, a cold clarity replacing the emotional devastation that had initially overwhelmed her. By the time they left the restaurant that night, their relationship was officially over, though Jessica was beginning to suspect that it had never really existed in the form she'd believed. Ryan's parting words, delivered with the practiced sincerity that had fooled her for so many months, would echo in her mind as she faced the professional destruction that was already being set in motion against her. "I hope you understand that this is for the best," he said, squeezing her shoulder with false comfort as they stood in the parking lot under the harsh fluorescent lights. "We both knew this day would come eventually. Now we can focus on what really matters without any distraction." As Jessica drove home through the quiet Austin streets, she couldn't shake the feeling that Ryan's betrayal was just the beginning of a much larger conspiracy designed to remove her from Summit Solutions entirely. The investigation that Amanda had warned her about was clearly targeting her specifically, and Ryan's quick abandonment of their relationship suggested that he'd known about it long before their conversation that evening. What Jessica didn't yet know was that her instincts about the scope of the conspiracy were absolutely correct, and that the professional destruction Ryan had helped orchestrate would ultimately lead to discoveries that would destroy him far more completely than anything she could have imagined in her darkest moments of betrayal and rage. The following morning brought with it a deceptive sense of normalcy that Jessica would later recognize as the calm before a devastating storm. She arrived at Summit Solutions early, hoping to lose herself in work and avoid the inevitable awkwardness of encountering Ryan in the hallways or common area. The familiar ritual of reviewing overnight emails and preparing for client meetings provided a temporary refuge from the emotional turmoil that had kept her awake most of the night. The first sign that her world was about to implode came in the form of an unexpected calendar invitation that appeared on her screen at exactly 9:50. The meeting request was formal and ominous in its brevity, simply stating that her presence was required in conference room A at 10:30 for a discussion regarding personnel matters. The sender was Lisa Parker from Human Resources, and the other attendees listed included Robert Hayes, the CEO, and Michael Rodriguez, whom Jessica recognized as a senior consultant from Pinnacle Consulting Group. Jessica's hands trembled slightly as she stared at the meeting invitation, her mind racing through possible explanations for why she would be summoned to such a high-level discussion with minimal notice. The presence of an outside consultant suggested that whatever was about to happen involved significant policy violations or potential legal implications for the company. The clinical language of the invitation and the formal tone suggested that this was not going to be a routine performance review or strategic planning session. Amanda appeared in Jessica's doorway within minutes of the invitation being sent, her face pale with concern and carrying a manila folder that she clutched against her chest like a shield. The speed of her arrival suggested that she'd been monitoring the situation closely and had been expecting this development, though her expression indicated that the reality was somehow worse than she'd anticipated. "Jessica, we need to talk immediately," Amanda said, closing the office door behind her and moving quickly to the chair across from Jessica's desk. "I've been doing some digging since our conversation yesterday, and what I've found is much worse than either of us imagined. They're not just investigating your relationship with Ryan, they've built an entire case against you that goes back months, and the evidence they've compiled is both extensive and deliberately misleading." The folder Amanda placed on Jessica's desk contained photocopies of documents that made Jessica's blood run cold as she flipped through them. Expense reports highlighted in red ink showed overlapping travel dates and destinations that had been presented in a way that suggested coordinated trips rather than coincidental business travel. Email exchanges between Jessica and Ryan that had been perfectly innocent in context were presented with surrounding messages removed, creating implications of impropriety that hadn't existed in the original communication. Most damaging of all were security badge records that showed Jessica and Ryan entering and leaving the building at similar times on multiple occasions, including several instances where they'd both been in the office late at night or early in the morning. The data had been meticulously compiled and analyzed to create a pattern that suggested a systematic deception rather than the sporadic coincidental interactions that had actually occurred. "This is a setup," Jessica said, her voice barely above a whisper as the full scope of the conspiracy against her became clear. "Someone has spent months building a case against me, carefully documenting every interaction between Ryan and me, and presenting it in the most damaging possible light. But why would they go to this much trouble? What could they possibly gain from destroying my career?" Amanda's expression grew even more grim as she reached into her purse and pulled out her phone, scrolling through a series of screenshots that she'd apparently captured from various internal company systems. The images showed email exchanges between Lisa Parker and Robert Hayes discussing Jessica's performance reviews, client relationships, and strategic value to the company. The tone of these exchanges was coldly analytical, treating Jessica as a problem to be solved rather than a valued employee whose rights deserved protection. "It gets worse," Amanda said, showing Jessica a particularly damning screenshot of an email from Robert Hayes to Lisa Parker dated 3 weeks earlier. "Read this carefully, and tell me if you notice anything significant about the timing." The email was brief but chilling in its implication. Robert Hayes had instructed Lisa Parker to conduct a thorough review of Jessica's professional relationships in compliance with company policies, specifically mentioning concerns about potential conflicts of interest that could expose Summit Solutions to legal liability. The date of the email was particularly significant because it preceded Jessica's conversation with Ryan about their relationship by nearly 2 weeks, suggesting that the investigation had been initiated before Ryan had any indication that Jessica was becoming suspicious about the company's changing dynamic. "They knew about our relationship long before yesterday," Jessica said, the pieces of the puzzle finally clicking into place with devastating clarity. "Someone has been watching us, documenting our interactions, and building a case against me while Ryan continued to act like everything was normal between us. But that means..." The implication hung in the air between them like a toxic cloud, poisoning Jessica's remaining faith in the man she'd thought she loved. If the investigation had been ongoing for weeks without Ryan's knowledge, his sudden decision to end their relationship couldn't have been motivated by genuine concern about an unexpected HR inquiry. Instead, it suggested that he'd been aware of the investigation all along and had been playing a much longer game than Jessica had realized. Amanda nodded grimly, confirming Jessica's worst fears about the scope of Ryan's betrayal. "I think he's been feeding them information for weeks, possibly months. The timing of certain meetings, the specific focus of their investigation, and the way certain evidence has been highlighted all suggest that someone with intimate knowledge of your relationship has been guiding the process. Ryan isn't just protecting himself by abandoning you, he's actively participating in your destruction." The revelation hit Jessica like a physical blow, forcing her to completely reevaluate every conversation, every intimate moment, and every shared dream she'd experienced with Ryan over the past 8 months. The man who had encouraged her to open up about her professional ambition, who had listened to her concerns about company politics, and who had shared her vision for their future together had apparently been documenting everything for use against her when the time came to eliminate her as a potential obstacle to his advancement. The buzzing of Jessica's phone interrupted her spiral of realization and betrayal. A text message from Ryan appeared on her screen, and the casual tone of his communication felt like salt being poured into an open wound. The message read simply, "Hope you're having a good morning. Let's grab lunch later to discuss some client strategy ideas." The Italian place at noon? The audacity of his message, sent less than 24 hours after he'd coldly terminated their relationship to protect his own interests, revealed a level of calculated manipulation that Jessica had never imagined him capable of. He was apparently planning to continue their professional relationship as if nothing significant had changed between them, while simultaneously participating in an investigation designed to destroy her career and reputation. "Don't respond to that," Amanda advised, reading the message over Jessica's shoulder. "Everything you say or do from this point forward will be scrutinized and potentially used against you. We need to assume that all your communications are being monitored and that every interaction with Ryan is being documented as potential evidence of policy violation." The next hour passed in a blur of frantic preparation as Amanda helped Jessica review the evidence that would likely be presented against her in the upcoming meeting. They discovered additional documentation that painted an even more damaging picture of Jessica's professional conduct, including client meeting schedules that had been manipulated to suggest inappropriate use of company resources for personal meetings, and project timelines that had been altered to make it appear that Jessica had been distracted from her responsibilities by her relationship with Ryan. The sophistication of the case against her suggested that this was not a routine HR investigation triggered by anonymous complaints or casual observation. Instead, it appeared to be a carefully orchestrated campaign designed to remove Jessica from the company while providing legal protection for Summit Solutions against potential wrongful termination claims. The level of detail and the systematic nature of the evidence compilation indicated that whoever was behind the investigation had significant resources and expertise in building legally defensible cases against targeted employees. As the time for her meeting approached, Jessica found herself grappling with the psychological impact of discovering that the past 8 months of her life had been built on a foundation of lies and manipulation. The Ryan Thompson she'd fallen in love with apparently didn't exist, replaced by a calculating opportunist who had been willing to exploit her emotions and trust to advance his own career while simultaneously gathering ammunition to destroy her when she was no longer useful to him. The walk to conference room felt like a march to her own execution, with Jessica acutely aware of the curious glances from colleagues who had apparently already heard rumor about what was happening. The efficiency of the office gossip network meant that news of her summons to a high-level HR meeting had probably spread throughout the company within minutes of the calendar invitation being sent, creating a cloud of speculation and suspicion that would follow her regardless of the meeting's outcome. Conference Room A was Summit Solutions' most formal meeting space, reserved for board presentations and important client negotiations. The choice of venue sent a clear message about the seriousness of the proceedings and the company's intention to handle Jessica's case with maximum corporate formality. The room's imposing mahogany table and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Austin created an atmosphere of intimidation that was clearly designed to make employees feel small and powerless in the face of corporate authority. Lisa Parker was already seated at the head of the table when Jessica arrived, flanked by Robert Hayes and Michael Rodriguez from Pinnacle Consulting Group. The arrangement of the participants was clearly deliberate, with Jessica directed to a single chair facing the 3-person panel like a defendant facing a tribunal. The formal setup suggested that this was not going to be a discussion or negotiation, but rather a presentation of predetermined conclusions, followed by the delivery of Jessica's professional sentence. "Thank you for joining us, Jessica," Lisa Parker began, her tone professional but cold as she opened a thick folder containing what appeared to be extensive documentation. "We've requested this meeting to discuss some serious concerns that have come to our attention regarding your compliance with company policies and your professional conduct over the past several months." The presentation that followed was a masterclass in corporate character assassination, with each piece of evidence carefully selected and presented to create the most damaging possible interpretation of Jessica's actions. The innocent text messages between her and Ryan were read aloud with emphasis on phrases that could be interpreted as having romantic implications. The overlapping travel schedules were presented as evidence of deliberate deception and misuse of company resources. The late-night office visits were characterized as inappropriate personal meetings conducted on company property. Most damaging of all was the testimony provided by several unnamed colleagues who had allegedly witnessed suspicious interactions between Jessica and Ryan. The anonymous nature of these reports made it impossible for Jessica to confront her accusers or provide context for the situations they described, while the specific details suggested that the witnesses had been carefully coached on what to observe and report. "The pattern of behavior we've documented represents a serious violation of our workplace relationship policies," Robert Hayes interjected when Lisa Parker had finished presenting the evidence. "More concerning is the apparent attempt to conceal this relationship through coordinated travel schedules and after-hours meetings that were not properly documented or approved through appropriate channels." Jessica listened to the accusations with growing horror, not just at the content, but at the sophisticated way the case had been constructed to make her defense nearly impossible. Every innocent explanation she might offer could be countered with additional evidence that had been carefully selected to support the predetermined narrative. The investigation had been designed not to discover the truth, but to build an unassailable case for her termination that would protect Summit Solutions from potential legal challenge. "I'd like to hear your response to these allegations," Michael Rodriguez said, speaking for the first time since Jessica had entered the room. His role as an outside consultant was apparently to provide an appearance of objectivity while ensuring that the company's legal interests were protected throughout the process. Jessica's response was carefully measured, focusing on factual corrections rather than emotional defenses that could be twisted against her. She explained the legitimate business reasons for her travel schedules, provided context for the text messages that had been taken out of context, and offered reasonable explanations for the after-hours office visits that had been characterized as suspicious. Her presentation was professional and composed, but she could see from the expressions of the panel that her explanations were being dismissed before she finished speaking. The most devastating moment came when Lisa Parker presented what she characterized as the final piece of evidence against Jessica. A security camera screenshot showed Jessica and Ryan leaving the building together late one evening, walking closely enough that their relationship appeared intimate to any observer. The image had been carefully selected from what were probably dozens of similar photos, chosen because it captured a moment that looked incriminating regardless of the innocent context. This photograph was taken 3 weeks ago, Lisa Parker explained, on an evening when both of you had signed out of the building separately according to security records, but clearly left together. This represents a deliberate attempt to deceive company security and hide the true nature of your relationship from appropriate oversight. The accusation was technically accurate but completely misleading, as Jessica and Ryan had indeed left the building together that evening after working late on a client proposal. However, their decision to sign out separately had been motivated by practical considerations rather than deceptive intent, as the security system required individual badge scans regardless of whether employees left together or separate. The characterization of this routine administrative process as evidence of deliberate deception showed the extent to which every aspect of Jessica's behavior was being interpreted in the most negative possible light. The meeting concluded with Lisa Parker delivering what was clearly a predetermined verdict disguised as a careful consideration of the evidence presented. Jessica's employment with Summit Solutions would be terminated immediately for violations of workplace relationship policies and failure to maintain appropriate professional boundaries. The termination would be characterized as voluntary resignation for personal reasons, protecting both Jessica's references and Summit Solutions' legal exposure, provided that Jessica signed a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement that would prevent her from discussing the circumstances of her departure. We believe this resolution serves everyone's best interests, Robert Hayes concluded, sliding a thick legal document across the table toward Jessica. You'll receive a generous severance package and positive references for future employment opportunities, and Summit Solutions can move forward without the disruption and potential liability that these policy violations have created. The document contained page after page of legal language designed to silence Jessica permanently about her treatment at Summit Solutions. The severance package was indeed generous, but it came with restrictions that would make it difficult for her to find comparable employment in Austin's competitive digital marketing industry. The non-compete clauses were particularly onerous, effectively preventing her from working for any of Summit Solutions' clients or competitors for a period of 2 years. As Jessica reviewed the termination agreement, she caught sight of Ryan Thompson through the conference room's glass wall. He was standing near the elevator bank, apparently waiting for the meeting to conclude so he could gauge the results of the investigation he had helped orchestrate. When their eyes met through the glass, he had the audacity to offer her a sympathetic smile and a subtle thumbs-up gesture, as if he were genuinely concerned about her welfare rather than celebrating the success of his betrayal. The realization that Ryan was monitoring her termination meeting while pretending to be unaware of its purpose represented the final piece of evidence Jessica needed to understand the true scope of his manipulation. He had not simply abandoned their relationship to protect his own interest. He had actively participated in building the case against her, providing insider information about their private conversations and intimate moments that had been used to construct the narrative of policy violations and professional misconduct. I need time to review this document with legal counsel before signing anything, Jessica said, gathering the papers and standing to leave the conference room. I assume I'll need to clear out my office immediately, but I'd prefer to handle the legal aspects of this termination through appropriate representation. The response clearly surprised the panel, who had apparently expected Jessica to sign the agreement immediately in exchange for the severance package and positive references. Lisa Parker's expression tightened with frustration, while Robert Hayes exchanged a meaningful glance with Michael Rodriguez that suggested they had hoped to conclude the matter quickly and quietly without involving outside legal representation. Of course, Michael Rodriguez replied smoothly, though his tone suggested that Jessica's decision to seek legal counsel was viewed as an unnecessary complication rather than a reasonable response to wrongful termination. However, I should mention that the terms we're offering today represent the company's final position on this matter. Involving attorneys and dragging out the process is unlikely to result in more favorable terms and could potentially damage the positive references we're prepared to provide. The threat was barely veiled, making it clear that Jessica's decision to fight the termination would result in the company withdrawing even the minimal protections they were currently offering. The strategy was designed to pressure employees into accepting unfavorable terms rather than risking a prolonged legal battle that could result in even worse outcomes. Jessica's walk back to her office was a gauntlet of curious stares and whispered conversations as word of her termination spread through the company with lightning speed. Colleagues who had been friendly and collaborative just hours earlier now avoided eye contact or offered awkward smiles that suggested they were already distancing themselves from someone who had been marked as a corporate pariah. The efficiency of the social ostracism showed how quickly professional relationships could evaporate when someone fell from grace within the corporate hierarchy. The process of clearing out her office was particularly humiliating, as Jessica was required to pack her personal belongings under the supervision of a security guard who treated her like a potential criminal rather than a longtime employee who had contributed significantly to the company's success. Years of awards, client appreciation letters, and project documentation were reduced to a few boxes of personal items that she was allowed to take with her, while everything related to her professional accomplishments remained the property of Summit Solutions. Amanda appeared during the packing process, ostensibly to help but actually to provide moral support during what was clearly designed to be a degrading experience. The security guard's presence made meaningful conversation impossible, but Amanda's silent companionship helped Jessica maintain her composure as she dismantled the professional life she had spent 8 years building. The most painful moment came when Ryan appeared in her office doorway, apparently concerned about the commotion and genuinely surprised to discover that Jessica was being terminated. His performance was Oscar-worthy in its apparent authenticity, with exactly the right combination of shock, sympathy, and professional concern to convince any observer that he had no prior knowledge of the investigation or its outcome. "Jessica, what's happening here?" he asked, his voice filled with what sounded like genuine confusion and concern. "Is this about the budget cuts we've been hearing rumors about? There has to be some mistake. You're one of our most valuable team members." The audacity of his performance, delivered with full knowledge of his role in orchestrating her termination, represented a level of psychological manipulation that Jessica was only beginning to comprehend. Ryan was not content merely to destroy her career. He was determined to torture her with a final demonstration of his acting abilities, showing her exactly how skillfully he had been deceiving her throughout their entire relationship. "No mistake," Jessica replied, her voice carefully controlled despite the rage boiling beneath the surface. "Apparently, there have been some policy violations that the company feels require immediate action. I'm sure you'll hear all about it through the usual channel." The security guard's presence prevented Jessica from saying anything more specific, but she made sure to maintain eye contact with Ryan long enough to let him know that she understood exactly what had happened and who was responsible for it. His brief moment of uncertainty, quickly masked by renewed concern, told her that he recognized the danger of her eventual retaliation even if he was confident that the legal restrictions would prevent her from taking immediate action. As Jessica carried her boxes to the parking garage, followed by the security guard who ensured that she left the building without incident, she felt the weight of complete professional and personal devastation settling over her like a suffocating blanket. 8 years of career advancement, professional relationships, and industry reputation had been destroyed in a single morning by a man she had trusted with her heart and her future. The drive home through Austin's afternoon traffic gave Jessica time to process the magnitude of what had happened to her and begin formulating a response strategy. The legal restrictions contained in the termination agreement were designed to prevent her from fighting back immediately, but they also contained loopholes and limitations that a skilled attorney might be able to exploit. More importantly, Jessica was beginning to suspect that the case against her contained fabricated evidence and potentially illegal surveillance that could expose Summit Solutions to significant legal liability if properly investigated. Ryan's betrayal had been thorough and devastating, but it had also been arrogant in its assumption that Jessica would accept her destruction passively. What he didn't understand was that his calculated manipulation had not broken her spirit, but had instead forged it into something harder and more dangerous than anything he could have anticipated. The woman who had been dismissed as a policy violator and professional liability was already beginning to transform into someone capable of systematic revenge that would make his betrayal look like a minor corporate inconvenience. The termination from Summit Solutions represented the end of one chapter of Jessica's life, but it was also the beginning of a much more interesting story that would eventually prove just how catastrophically Ryan Thompson had underestimated the woman he had chosen to betray. The evidence he had helped compile against her would eventually be turned against him with devastating effect, and the company that had protected him would discover that their legal strategies were no match for someone with nothing left to lose and everything to prove. The apartment that had once felt like a sanctuary now seemed like a prison cell, with every corner reminding Jessica of the dreams and ambitions that had been systematically destroyed in a single morning. The boxes of personal belongings from her office sat unopened in the living room, tangible evidence of a professional life that had been reduced to a few cardboard containers under the watchful eye of a security guard. The silence was deafening after 8 years of constant phone calls, urgent emails, and the productive chaos of managing multiple client campaigns simultaneously. Jessica found herself unable to eat, sleep, or concentrate on anything beyond the endless loop of betrayal and humiliation that played in her mind like a broken record. Every conversation with Ryan took on new meaning when viewed through the lens of his deception, every intimate moment now tainted by the knowledge that he had been documenting their relationship for eventual use against her. The man who had held her close and whispered about their future together had been calculating the best way to destroy her career while she slept peacefully beside him. The financial implications of her sudden unemployment began to sink in as Jessica reviewed her savings account and monthly expenses. The generous severance package offered by Summit Solutions came with strings attached that made it effectively worthless unless she signed the non-disclosure agreement that would prevent her from ever telling the truth about her termination. Without the severance, her savings would last perhaps 3 months while she searched for new employment in an industry where her former colleagues now viewed her as a liability rather than an asset. Amanda's daily phone calls provided the only connection to the professional world that had been Jessica's identity for nearly a decade. But even those conversations were fraught with the knowledge that their friendship could cost Amanda her own career if she was perceived as supporting someone who had been terminated for policy violation. The corporate machine that had once protected and advanced Jessica's interests was now actively working to isolate her from anyone who might provide assistance or emotional support. The worst part wasn't the financial uncertainty or even the professional devastation, but the complete erosion of Jessica's ability to trust her own judgment about people and situations. If she had been so completely wrong about Ryan's character and motivations, how could she trust any of her perceptions about the professional relationships and opportunities that would be crucial to rebuilding her career? The psychological damage ran deeper than the practical consequences, undermining her confidence in the very skills and instincts that had made her successful in the first place. Days blended into weeks as Jessica struggled with the crushing weight of depression that made even basic tasks feel insurmountable. The apartment grew cluttered with unwashed dishes and unopened mail, while Jessica spent most of her time in bed, scrolling through social media updates from former colleagues who were continuing their careers as if nothing had happened. The cognitive dissonance between their normal professional lives and her complete exile from that world created a sense of unreality that made it difficult to believe that her termination had actually occurred. Ryan's LinkedIn profile became a particular source of torture as Jessica found herself checking it obsessively to see how he was thriving in the aftermath of her destruction. His posts about successful client campaigns and industry insights generated dozens of congratulatory comments from colleagues who praised his leadership and vision, while his professional photographs smiled back at Jessica with the same charming confidence that had initially attracted her to him. The man who had systematically destroyed her life was being celebrated as a rising star in Austin's business community, The isolation was particularly brutal for someone who had thrived on professional interaction and collaborative problem-solving for her entire adult life. Jessica's identity had been so thoroughly intertwined with her career success that unemployment felt like a form of psychological death, leaving her unclear about who she was or what she had to offer the world beyond the corporate title and responsibilities that had defined her for 8 years. Sleep became elusive as Jessica's mind raced through endless scenarios of revenge and vindication that ranged from public exposure of Ryan's manipulation to fantasies of professional comeback that would demonstrate his catastrophic error in underestimating her capability. But these mental exercises always ended with the cold reality of the legal restrictions contained in her termination agreement, and the systematic ways Summit Solutions had protected themselves from potential retaliation. The breaking point came 6 weeks after her termination, when Jessica discovered through Amanda's careful investigation that Ryan had been promoted to senior vice president, with expanded responsibilities that included oversight of the marketing department where Jessica had once been considered irreplaceable. The promotion was announced internally as recognition of Ryan's exceptional leadership during a period of organizational transition, with no mention of the policy violations investigation that had conveniently eliminated his primary competition for advancement. The realization that Ryan's betrayal had been motivated not just by self-preservation but by active ambition to claim her position and responsibilities, pushed Jessica past the paralysis of depression into a cold fury that began to clear her mind for the first time since her termination. The man who had destroyed her career hadn't simply thrown her under the bus to save himself. He had orchestrated her removal specifically to create the opening for his own advancement, using their intimate relationship as both a weapon against her and a stepping stone for his own climb up the corporate ladder. That night, Jessica finally opened the boxes from her office and began systematically reviewing 8 years of professional documentation, looking for patterns and evidence that might reveal vulnerabilities in the case that had been built against her. The awards, client letters, and performance reviews painted a picture of consistent excellence that contradicted the narrative of unprofessional behavior and policy violations that had been used to justify her termination. More importantly, Jessica's meticulous record-keeping revealed discrepancies in the timeline of events that Summit Solutions had presented as evidence of her misconduct. Several of the supposedly suspicious meetings and travel overlaps had occurred during periods when Ryan had been out of town on legitimate business, making the alleged coordination impossible. The fabricated nature of some evidence suggested that the investigation had been conducted with predetermined conclusions, rather than objective fact-finding. The discovery of these inconsistencies provided Jessica with the first spark of hope she had felt since her termination, as she began to understand that the seemingly airtight case against her contained fundamental flaws that a skilled attorney might be able to exploit. The arrogance that had led Ryan and Summit Solutions to construct such an elaborate deception had also created vulnerabilities that could potentially be used to expose the entire conspiracy. Jessica's first meaningful step toward recovery came when she contacted Sarah Mitchell, employment attorney who specialized in wrongful termination cases involving workplace harassment and discrimination. Sarah's initial consultation revealed that the non-disclosure agreement Jessica had been pressured to sign contained several potentially unenforceable provisions, particularly those that would prevent her from reporting illegal activities or cooperating with government investigation. More promising was Sarah's assessment that the evidence compilation against Jessica showed signs of potential privacy violations and illegal surveillance that could expose Summit Solutions to significant legal liability. The systematic tracking of employee movements, monitoring of personal communications, and coordination with unnamed witnesses suggested an investigation that had exceeded the legal boundaries of workplace policy enforcement. Companies often overreach when they're trying to build bulletproof termination cases, Sarah explained during their first meeting in her downtown office, overlooking Lady Bird Lake. They become so focused on documenting policy violations that they violate privacy laws and employment regulations in the process. If we can prove that Summit Solutions conducted illegal surveillance or fabricated evidence against you, the non-disclosure agreement becomes void and we can pursue significant damages for wrongful termination. The legal consultation provided Jessica with something she hadn't experienced since her termination: a sense of agency,
and the possibility of fighting back against the forces that had destroyed her career. Sarah's confidence in the strength of a potential case against Summit Solutions began to restore Jessica's faith in her own perceptions and judgment, validating her instinct that the investigation had been fundamentally unfair and potentially criminal in its scope. The process of building a legal case required Jessica to reconstruct the timeline of her relationship with Ryan in excruciating detail, documenting every conversation, every shared meal, and every professional interaction that had been twisted into evidence of policy violation. The exercise was emotionally devastating but also therapeutic, as it allowed Jessica to see clearly how systematically she had been manipulated and betrayed by someone she had trusted completely. The investigation also revealed the extent to which Ryan had been feeding information to Lisa Parker and Robert Hayes throughout their relationship, providing details about Jessica's client strategies, professional ambition, and personal vulnerabilities that had been used to construct the case against her. The level of detail in the company's documentation could only have come from someone with intimate access to Jessica's private thoughts and professional plans. As Sarah's investigation progressed, a more complex picture began to emerge of the corporate politics that had motivated Jessica's termination. Summit Solutions had been struggling financially for months before the investigation began, with several major clients threatening to leave due to declining service quality and innovative stagnation. The company's leadership had been under pressure from board members and investors to demonstrate decisive action to address these problems.
Jessica's termination had served multiple purposes beyond simply eliminating a supposed policy violator. It had provided a scapegoat for the company's broader performance issues while simultaneously creating an opening for Ryan's promotion to a role where he could claim credit for any improvements in client relationships or campaign effectiveness. The timing of the investigation and termination had been carefully orchestrated to maximize these benefits while minimizing legal exposure. The realization that her personal destruction had been just one element in a larger corporate strategy designed to deflect responsibility for systemic failures added another layer of outrage to Jessica's growing determination to fight back. She hadn't simply been betrayed by a lover who prioritized his career over their relationship. She had been sacrificed as part of a calculated plan to save a struggling Kerngi's reputation and provide cover for executive incompetence. Sarah's investigation also uncovered evidence that Jessica wasn't the first employee to be targeted through this type of systematic character assassination. 2 other senior managers had been terminated in the previous year under similar circumstances, with their departures characterized as voluntary resignations for personal reasons, despite evidence of coordinated campaigns to document policy violations and professional misconduct. The pattern suggested that Summit Solutions had developed a systematic approach to eliminating employees who posed threats to existing power structures or whose compensation packages had become inconvenient during financial difficulties. The company's legal team had apparently refined their techniques for building termination cases that would survive legal challenges while avoiding wrongful termination liability. "This is bigger than just your case," Sarah explained during one of their strategy sessions. Summit Solutions appears to be operating what amounts to a systematic program of employment law violations designed to circumvent worker protections and avoid paying proper severance or unemployment benefit. If we can prove this pattern, we're looking at potential class action liability and significant regulatory violation. The scope of Summit Solutions' apparent misconduct provided Jessica with a sense of purpose that extended beyond personal vindication to something approaching a moral crusade against corporate abuse of employee rights. The knowledge that other careers had been destroyed through similar tactics transformed her desire for revenge into a commitment to justice that felt both personally satisfying and professionally meaningful. As the legal case developed, Jessica began to experience the first stirrings of genuine recovery from the psychological devastation of her termination and betrayal. The process of fighting back against the forces that had destroyed her career provided a sense of agency and control that gradually replaced the helplessness and depression that had consumed her for weeks after leaving Summit Solutions. The financial pressure remained intense, as Jessica's savings dwindled while she focused on building her legal case rather than searching for new employment. The non-compete clauses in her termination agreement made it difficult to pursue opportunities in Austin's digital marketing industry, while the potential legal proceedings created additional complications for any employer who might consider hiring her. But for the first time since Ryan's betrayal, Jessica felt like she was moving forward rather than simply surviving the aftermath of professional destruction. The legal investigation was revealing vulnerabilities in Summit Solutions' position that could potentially be exploited for both financial compensation and public vindication of her professional reputation. The transformation wasn't immediate or complete, as Jessica continued to struggle with trust issues and confidence problems that would take much longer to resolve than any legal proceeding. The psychological damage inflicted by Ryan's systematic manipulation ran deeper than professional setbacks, undermining her faith in her own judgment about people and relationships in ways that would require years of healing. But the seeds of recovery had been planted, and Jessica was beginning to understand that her termination from Summit Solutions might ultimately prove to be the catalyst for something much more significant than the corporate career she had lost. The knowledge and experience she was gaining about employment law violations and corporate misconduct was opening up possibilities for a different kind of professional future that could provide both personal satisfaction and meaningful impact on the lives of other workers who had been similarly abused. The legal investigation was also revealing just how extensively Ryan had betrayed not only their personal relationship but also their professional partnership. His theft of her strategic ideas and client relationship insights had been systematic and thorough, providing him with intellectual property that he was now using to build his own reputation while Jessica was excluded from the industry where those innovations had originated. As Sarah compiled evidence for their potential lawsuit, Jessica began to see opportunities for exposing not just the illegal tactics used against her but also the ongoing theft of her professional contributions that Ryan was using to advance his own career. The prospect of reclaiming credit for her innovations while simultaneously destroying the man who had stolen them provided a focus for Jessica's anger that was both personally satisfying and professionally strategic. The investigation phase of Jessica's recovery was drawing to a close, but it had served its purpose of transforming her from a victim of corporate abuse into someone capable of systematic retaliation. The woman who had been devastated by betrayal was evolving into someone who understood exactly how to use the legal system and corporate vulnerability to achieve both justice and revenge. Ryan Thompson had made the catastrophic error of assuming that his destruction of Jessica's career would eliminate her as a threat to his continued advancement. Instead, his betrayal had created something much more dangerous: a highly motivated adversary with nothing left to lose, and an intimate understanding of both his vulnerabilities and the illegal tactics that Summit Solutions had used to protect him. The foundation for Jessica's eventual triumph was being laid through careful legal preparation and strategic planning that would ultimately prove far more devastating to Ryan and Summit Solutions than anything they could have anticipated when they decided to sacrifice her career for their own convenience. The call came on a Thursday morning exactly 9 months after Jessica's termination from Summit Solutions, delivered by Sarah Mitchell with barely contained excitement in her voice. The federal investigation that had been quietly proceeding for months had finally reached the point where action could be taken, and the evidence they had compiled painted a picture of corporate malfeasance that exceeded even Jessica's worst suspicions about the conspiracy that had destroyed her career. "Jessica, you need to get down to my office immediately," Sarah said, her professional composure cracking slightly as she struggled to contain her enthusiasm. "The Department of Labor investigators have finished their review of Summit Solutions' employment practices, and what they've discovered is going to change everything. Not just for your case, but for dozens of other employees who have been systematically abused by this company over the past 3 years." The federal building in downtown Austin had never looked more welcoming as Jessica made her way through security and up to Sarah's office on the 15th floor. The months of painstaking legal preparation and investigation had taken their toll on Jessica's finances and emotional reserves, but the promise in Sarah's voice suggested that all the sacrifice and uncertainty were about to pay dividends that would exceed her most optimistic expectations. The conference room where Sarah had assembled the evidence was dominated by a wall-sized timeline that traced Summit Solutions' systematic pattern of targeting high-performing employees for termination through fabricated policy violations and character assassination campaigns. Jessica's case was just one point on a much larger map of corporate abuse that included manipulated expense reports, illegal surveillance of employee communications, and coordination with unnamed witnesses whose testimony had been coached by company attorneys. The investigators have uncovered evidence of at least 15 employees who were terminated through similar tactics over the past 3 years, Sarah explained, pointing to various points on the timeline where red flags indicated suspicious termination. In each case, the pattern was identical: identify a high-performing employee whose compensation or position had become inconvenient, initiate a covert investigation to document supposed policy violations, and then terminate them in a way that would minimize severance costs and legal liability. The scope of Summit Solutions' misconduct was staggering in its systematic nature and brazen disregard for employment law protection. The company had essentially created an internal apparatus for manufacturing justifications to terminate employees whose positions could be eliminated for financial reasons or whose independent thinking posed threats to existing power structure. The legal and financial implications were potentially catastrophic for a company that was already struggling with declining revenue and client defection. More damaging still was the evidence of coordination between Summit Solutions and other companies in Austin's business community to share information about terminated employees and prevent them from finding comparable employment elsewhere. The non-compete agreements that had seemed merely restrictive were actually part of a broader conspiracy to blacklist workers who had been targeted for elimination, creating a shadow system of professional punishment that operated outside any legal framework. Ryan Thompson's role in this conspiracy goes far beyond just your case, Sarah continued, pulling up a separate file that contained months of email exchanges between Ryan and various company executives. He appears to have been the primary coordinator for gathering intelligence on targeted employees, using his access to personal relationships and confidential information to build cases against people who threatened his own advancement opportunity. The emails revealed Ryan's systematic betrayal in devastating detail, showing how he had documented private conversations with Jessica and other colleagues to provide ammunition for termination cases that were already being planned months before any supposed policy violations occurred. His promotion to senior vice president hadn't been a reward for exceptional performance, but rather compensation for his role as an internal informant who helped the company eliminate expensive or inconvenient employees. The evidence also revealed that Jessica's relationship with Ryan had been targeted specifically because her marketing expertise and client relationships made her elimination particularly valuable to Summit Solutions' cost-cutting objective. The company had been planning to merge the marketing and sales departments under Ryan's leadership, eliminating Jessica's position while transferring her responsibilities to someone who would work for significantly less compensation. The personal relationship aspect was actually incidental to their primary objective, Sarah explained, her anger evident as she described the calculated nature of the conspiracy. They would have found a way to terminate you regardless of your involvement with Ryan. The relationship just provided a convenient framework for building a harassment case that would discourage you from fighting back through legal channels. The federal investigators had also uncovered evidence of financial irregularities at Summit Solutions that suggested the systematic termination of high-paid employees was part of a broader scheme to manipulate the company's financial statements for potential sale or merger opportunity. The elimination of experienced employees and their replacement with lower-paid alternatives had artificially inflated the company's profit margins while concealing fundamental problems with client retention and service quality. Summit Solutions has been operating as essentially a criminal enterprise designed to defraud both employees and potential investors, Sarah said, her voice taking on the tone of a prosecutor presenting closing argument. The termination scheme was just one component of a larger pattern of illegal activities that could result in both civil and criminal liability for everyone involved in the conspiracy. The implications for Ryan personally were particularly severe, as his role as the primary intelligence gatherer for the termination scheme made him vulnerable to federal charges related to conspiracy, fraud, and violations of privacy law. The emails he had sent detailing private conversations with targeted employees constituted evidence of systematic invasion of privacy and potential wire fraud charges that could result in significant jail time. Ryan's cooperation in building cases against his colleagues wasn't just unethical, Sarah explained with obvious satisfaction. It was criminal. The systematic violation of privacy rights and the use of that information to defraud employees of their rightful compensation creates federal liability that the company's legal protections can't shield him from. The timing of the federal investigation's conclusions couldn't have been more perfect from Jessica's perspective, as Summit Solutions was in the middle of delicate negotiations for acquisition by a larger marketing conglomerate that had been attracted by the company's apparently improved financial performance. The revelation of systematic employment law violations and potential criminal liability would almost certainly torpedo any acquisition discussions while exposing the acquirer to significant legal and financial risk. The acquisition talks have been suspended pending resolution of the federal investigation, Sarah reported with barely concealed glee. The potential buyer has indicated that they're not interested in purchasing a company with this level of legal exposure, especially when the financial improvements that attracted their interest were achieved through illegal employment practices. The collapse of the acquisition negotiations had immediate implications for Summit Solutions' financial stability, as the company had been counting on the sale to address mounting debt obligations and declining client revenue. Without the acquisition proceeds, the company faced potential bankruptcy within months, creating additional leverage for the wrongful termination lawsuits that were being prepared on behalf of Jessica and the other targeted employees. More satisfying from Jessica's personal perspective was the impact that the federal investigation was having on Ryan's reputation and career prospects within Austin's business community. News of his role as an informant in the termination scheme had leaked through professional networks, creating a toxic cloud of suspicion and distrust that made him effectively unemployable in any position requiring access to confidential information or employee relationships. Ryan's attempt to advance his career by destroying his colleagues has backfired spectacularly, Sarah observed during one of their strategy sessions. No company is going to risk hiring someone who has demonstrated such a willingness to betray confidential information and manipulate personal relationships for professional advantage. His reputation in this industry is permanently destroyed. The irony of Ryan's situation was particularly delicious to Jessica, as the man who had sacrificed their relationship to protect his career advancement had actually destroyed any possibility of continued success in Austin's interconnected business community. His betrayal of Jessica and other colleagues had been motivated by short-term ambition, but the long-term consequences would make him a pariah in the very industry where he had hoped to build his legacy. The legal proceedings that followed moved with surprising speed, as Summit Solutions attorneys quickly recognized that their position was indefensible in the face of overwhelming federal evidence of systematic employment law violation. The company's financial distress also made prolonged litigation impractical, creating pressure for quick settlement negotiations that would minimize additional legal costs and public exposure. Jessica's individual settlement was substantial enough to provide financial security for several years while she decided on her next career move, but the personal satisfaction came primarily from the complete vindication of her professional reputation and the public exposure of the conspiracy that had destroyed so many careers. The settlement also included provisions for public acknowledgement of the company's wrongdoing and Jessica's complete innocence of any policy violation. More importantly, the federal investigation had created opportunities for Jessica to transition into a completely different type of career that would allow her to use her experience as a victim of corporate abuse to help other workers who had been similarly targeted. Several employment law firms had approached her about consulting opportunities that would combine her business expertise with her intimate understanding of corporate manipulation tactics. The transformation from victim to advocate represented a profound shift in Jessica's sense of purpose and professional identity. The career she was building in employment law and worker advocacy provided not just financial compensation but also meaningful work that could prevent other professionals from experiencing the systematic abuse that had nearly destroyed her own life. The personal healing that accompanied her professional vindication was equally significant, as Jessica gradually rebuilt her ability to trust her own judgment about people and situations. The clarity that came from understanding exactly how she had been manipulated allowed her to process the emotional trauma of Ryan's betrayal while developing better instincts for recognizing deceptive behavior in future relationships. Ryan's complete professional destruction provided a sense of justice that was more satisfying
satisfying than any personal revenge Jessica could have conceived. The man who had calculated that betraying her would advance his career had instead ensured his own permanent exile from the industry where he had hoped to build his reputation. His attempt to use their relationship as a weapon against her had ultimately become the evidence that destroyed his own prospects for continued success. The final irony came 18 months after Jessica's termination, when she received a call from Michael Rodriguez at Pinnacle Consulting Group, with an offer that would have seemed impossible during her darkest days of unemployment and depression. Pinnacle had been hired to conduct the acquisition due diligence that had ultimately exposed Summit Solutions' criminal activities, and they had been impressed by Jessica's role in uncovering the systematic employment law violation. "We're looking for someone with your unique combination of marketing expertise and employment law experience to lead our new division focused on corporate compliance and worker protection," Michael explained during their lunch meeting at the same restaurant where Ryan had coldly terminated their relationship more than a year earlier. "Your experience as both a victim and an advocate gives you insights that no traditional consultant could provide." The position offered not just financial compensation that exceeded her previous salary at Summit Solutions, but also the opportunity to work directly with companies throughout Texas to identify and eliminate the types of systematic abuse that had destroyed so many careers. The irony of using her experience as Ryan's victim to build a more successful career than she could have achieved through their original relationship was not lost on Jessica as she accepted the offer. The final chapter of Jessica's vindication came when Pinnacle Consulting Group announced their acquisition of Summit Solutions' remaining assets after the company's inevitable bankruptcy. The purchase price was a fraction of what the company might have commanded before the federal investigation exposed their criminal activities, but it provided Pinnacle with valuable client relationships and intellectual property that could be integrated into their expanding operation. As the newly appointed Director of Compliance and Employee Relations for Pinnacle's Texas operations, Jessica found herself in the position of overseeing the integration of Summit Solutions' former employees into Pinnacle's corporate culture. The role reversal was complete and deeply satisfying, as she now had the authority to ensure that the systematic abuse that had characterized Summit's employment practices would never be repeated under Pinnacle's ownership. The morning of the acquisition announcement brought Jessica full circle to the boardroom where her professional journey had begun, but now she sat at the head of the table as the person responsible for determining the future of the company that had once destroyed her career. The executives who had participated in her termination were now supplicants hoping for consideration in Pinnacle's restructured organization.
It demonstrated the ultimate futility of building professional success through manipulation and betrayal, while validating the long-term value of ethical behavior and genuine competence in creating sustainable career advancement. Ryan's spectacular fall from grace served as a warning to other professionals who might be tempted to advance their careers through the systematic abuse of colleagues and subordinates. As Jessica prepared for another day of meaningful work that combined professional success with ethical purpose, she felt grateful for the painful journey that had transformed her from a naive believer in corporate loyalty into someone capable of systematic reform of abusive employment practices. Ryan's betrayal had been devastating in the immediate term, but it had ultimately provided the catalyst for personal and professional growth that made her current success possible. The story that had begun with devastating betrayal in an Austin restaurant had culminated in complete vindication and transformation that exceeded Jessica's most optimistic dreams of recovery. The woman who had once been destroyed by trusting the wrong person had become someone capable of protecting others from similar abuse, while building a career based on authentic values and genuine competence rather than manipulation and betrayal. The morning sunlight filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Jessica's corner office at Pinnacle Consulting Group, casting long shadows across the mahogany desk where she reviewed the final quarterly reports that would close out the most successful year in the company's history. 3 years had passed since the federal investigation exposed Summit Solutions' systematic employment violations, and the transformation of both companies had exceeded even the most optimistic projections that the acquisition team had prepared during their initial due diligence process. The irony of sitting in an office that dwarfed her former workspace at Summit Solutions was not lost on Jessica as she prepared for the day's board presentation, where she would outline Pinnacle's expansion plans for the upcoming fiscal year. The woman who had once been terminated for alleged policy violations was now responsible for implementing compliance standards across a multi-state operation that employed more than 2,000 professionals in various consulting disciplines. The personal satisfaction of professional vindication had long since evolved into something more meaningful and sustainable. The deep fulfillment that came from building something genuinely valuable rather than simply proving wrong the people who had underestimated her capability. The revenge that had once consumed her thoughts during the darkest days following her termination had been replaced by a sense of purpose that extended far beyond personal grievances to encompass meaningful reform of corporate practices that affected thousands of workers throughout the region. Amanda Chen knocked on Jessica's door with the familiar rhythm that had become their signal for important but non-urgent conversations. Carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the satisfied expression that typically indicated positive developments in their ongoing project. As Pinnacle's Director of Financial Operations, Amanda had thrived in the ethical business environment that Jessica had worked to establish, her natural integrity and analytical skills finally receiving the recognition they deserved after years of being overshadowed by the political maneuvering that had characterized Summit Solutions' toxic culture. The final numbers are in from the Department of Labor's compliance review, Amanda announced, settling into the comfortable chair across from Jessica's desk and sliding one of the coffee cups across the polished surface. Pinnacle has received the highest possible rating for employment practices and worker protection, making us eligible for federal contracts that could increase our revenue by 40% over the next 2 years. The achievement represented more than just financial success for Jessica, as the federal certification validated her approach to building a corporate culture based on genuine respect for employee rights rather than the exploitative practices that had characterized her former employer. The consulting contracts that would flow from this certification would also provide opportunities to influence employment practices at other companies throughout Texas and the broader Southwest region. More importantly, Amanda continued, her voice taking on the tone of personal satisfaction that accompanied their most meaningful victories. The compliance review specifically cited our innovative approach to preventing workplace harassment and discrimination as a model that other companies should emulate. 3 Fortune 500 companies have already requested consulting engagements to help them implement similar programs in their own operations. The consulting requests represented validation of Jessica's belief that ethical business practices could be both morally correct and financially advantageous, providing competitive advantages that exceeded anything achievable through the manipulative tactics that Ryan and Summit Solutions had employed. The companies seeking Pinnacle's guidance had recognized that sustainable success required building trust with employees rather than exploiting their vulnerabilities for short-term financial gain. The transformation of Summit Solutions' former employees under Pinnacle's ethical leadership had been particularly gratifying to observe, as talented professionals who had been demoralized by the previous company's toxic culture rediscovered their enthusiasm for meaningful work. The productivity improvements and innovation that resulted from treating employees with genuine respect had contributed significantly to Pinnacle's financial success while demonstrating the business value of ethical leadership practice. David Kim, who had been Summit Solutions' IT director before the acquisition, appeared in Jessica's doorway with the slightly nervous expression that typically preceded important technical announcements. His transformation from a paranoid middle manager constantly worried about surveillance and political attacks to a confident technology leader had been one of the most dramatic examples of how corporate culture affected individual performance and job satisfaction. Jessica, I have some interesting news from our digital forensics review of Summit's old systems, David said, glancing around to ensure their conversation wouldn't be overheard despite the open and transparent communication culture that Jessica had established. We've discovered additional evidence of the systematic privacy violations that were part of the federal investigation, including some activities that weren't covered in the original criminal charge. The discovery represented potential complications for the legal settlements that had resolved most of the employment law violations, but it also provided opportunities to pursue additional remedies for employees who had been targeted by Summit Solutions' surveillance program. The systematic monitoring of employee communications and personal activities had been even more extensive than the federal investigators had initially determined, creating potential liability that could extend beyond the original defense. The surveillance program included monitoring of personal social media accounts, tracking of off-duty activities through company-issued devices, and coordination with other employers to share information about terminated employees, David explained. His technical expertise allowing him to understand the full scope of the privacy violations in ways that legal professionals might miss. Some of these activities continued even after employees left the company, creating potential stalking and harassment charges that weren't addressed in the original proceeding. The implications of the continued surveillance were particularly disturbing because they suggested that Summit Solutions management had been systematically gathering intelligence on former employees to prevent them from finding comparable employment elsewhere. The blacklisting activities that had been suspected during the original investigation were now confirmed through digital evidence that could support additional criminal charges against the perpetrator. Ryan Thompson's involvement in the extended surveillance appears to have been particularly extensive, David continued, pulling out a tablet that displayed email exchanges and system logs documenting months of illegal monitoring activity. He was apparently coordinating with contacts at other companies to share negative information about terminated employees, including fabricated performance concerns and personal details that could only have been obtained through illegal surveillance. The revelation that Ryan's betrayal had extended beyond Jessica's termination to include systematic sabotage of other former employees' career prospects added another dimension to the criminal conspiracy that had destroyed so many professional lives. His actions had not been limited to protecting his own advancement opportunities, but had included active efforts to ensure that his victims remained unemployable and financially desperate. The most disturbing aspect is that the surveillance continued for more than a year after people left Summit Solutions, David explained, his technical analysis revealing the calculated cruelty behind the systematic abuse. Ryan was apparently maintaining detailed files on former employees' job search activities, new employment opportunities, and personal relationships, using this information to contact their potential employers with damaging allegations about their professional conduct and reliability. The scope of Ryan's ongoing harassment campaign explained why so many talented professionals who had been terminated from Summit Solutions had struggled to find comparable employment despite their obvious qualifications and track record of success. The systematic sabotage of their career prospects had been invisible to the victims, but devastatingly effective in preventing them from rebuilding their professional lives. Jessica felt a familiar surge of cold anger as she absorbed the implications of David's discoveries, not just for herself but for the dozens of other professionals whose lives had been systematically destroyed by Ryan's calculated cruelty. The man who had claimed to love her had not simply betrayed their relationship and engineered her termination. He had spent more than a year actively working to ensure that she and other former colleagues remained unemployed and financially desperate. "We need to compile all of this evidence and present it to the federal prosecutors who handled the original case," Jessica said, her voice taking on the decisiveness that had become characteristic of her leadership style. If Ryan was engaged in systematic stalking and harassment of former employees, he needs to face additional criminal charges that reflect the full scope of his illegal activity. The legal implications of the new evidence were significant because the continued surveillance and harassment activities had occurred after Ryan's plea agreement in the original federal case, potentially voiding the protections he had negotiated in exchange for his cooperation with investigators. The additional charges could result in substantial jail time and financial penalties that would ensure his complete inability to continue his harassment campaign. More importantly for Jessica's sense of justice, the new evidence provided opportunities to seek additional compensation for the extended period of career sabotage that had prolonged the financial and emotional damage caused by her wrongful termination. The systematic nature of Ryan's harassment campaign created liability that extended far beyond the original employment law violations to include potential federal charges related to stalking, computer fraud, and conspiracy. The afternoon brought a meeting with Sarah Mitchell, whose legal practice had expanded significantly as a result of the publicity generated by the Summit Solutions case and the federal certification of Pinnacle's employment practices. Sarah's expertise in corporate abuse cases had made her one of the most sought-after employment attorneys in Texas, with a client list that included executives from Fortune 500 companies who had been targeted by similar systematic termination schemes. The additional evidence that David discovered creates some interesting opportunities for expanding our legal remedies, Sarah explained during their strategy session in Pinnacle's conference room overlooking downtown Austin. The extended harassment campaign violates several federal statutes that weren't applicable to the original employment law case, including computer fraud charges that carry mandatory minimum sentences for repeat offenders. The federal computer fraud charges were particularly significant because Ryan's systematic monitoring of former employees' digital activities constituted unauthorized access to protected systems and networks, creating criminal liability that could result in years of imprisonment regardless of any cooperation he might offer in other cases. The mandatory minimum sentences meant that prosecutors would have limited discretion in negotiating plea agreements that would allow him to escape serious consequences. More importantly for the other victims of his harassment campaign, Sarah continued, the new evidence establishes a pattern of systematic abuse that could support a class action lawsuit seeking damages for all the employees who were targeted by Summit Solutions' termination scheme and subsequent blacklisting activity. The class action approach would provide legal remedies for dozens of professionals whose careers had been destroyed but who lacked the individual resources to pursue lengthy litigation against well-funded corporate defendants. The collective approach would also create additional pressure for criminal prosecutors to pursue the most serious possible charges against the perpetrators of the systematic abuse. The financial implications of the expanded legal case were substantial, but Jessica's primary motivation had evolved beyond personal compensation to encompass broader accountability for the systematic abuse that had affected so many talented professionals. The opportunity to ensure that Ryan faced serious criminal consequences for his extended harassment campaign provided a sense of justice that exceeded any monetary settlement. I want to make sure that every person whose career was sabotaged by Ryan's harassment campaign receives appropriate compensation and public vindication, Jessica told Sarah during their planning discussion. The systematic nature of his abuse deserves systematic accountability that will prevent other corporate psychopaths from believing they can destroy people's lives without facing serious consequences. The investigation into Ryan's extended harassment activities revealed disturbing details about the psychological motivations behind his systematic cruelty toward former colleagues. The digital evidence suggested that his sabotage campaign had been motivated not just by professional calculation but by personal enjoyment of his victims' suffering, with detailed documentation of their financial struggles and emotional distress that served no legitimate business purpose. Ryan appears to have been maintaining what amounts to trophy files documenting the damage caused by his harassment activities, David explained during a technical briefing on the digital forensics discovery. The level of detail and the apparent satisfaction he took in recording his victims' struggles suggest psychological issues that go far beyond typical corporate misconduct. The revelation that Ryan had been systematically documenting and apparently celebrating the destruction of his former colleagues' lives added a deeply disturbing personal dimension to what had initially appeared to be calculated but emotionally detached corporate abuse. The evidence suggested a level of psychological cruelty that exceeded normal business competition and entered the realm of genuine sadistic behavior. The psychological profile that emerged from the digital evidence also explained why Ryan's harassment campaign had been so persistent and effective in preventing his victims from rebuilding their career. His systematic approach to sabotage had been motivated by genuine pleasure in causing suffering rather than simple professional calculation, making him willing to invest significant time and effort in activities that served no business purpose beyond inflicting damage. The federal prosecutors who reviewed the new evidence expressed shock at the systematic nature of Ryan's harassment campaign and the apparent psychological motivations behind his continued abuse of former colleagues. The pattern of behavior documented in the digital evidence suggested potential federal charges related to cyberstalking and systematic harassment that could result in decades of imprisonment if prosecuted to the full extent of the law. This level of systematic harassment and psychological abuse represents one of the most extensive cases of corporate-enabled stalking that our office has encountered, the lead federal prosecutor explained during a meeting with Jessica and her legal team. The evidence suggests a pattern of behavior that goes far beyond typical employment law violations to include serious federal crimes that threaten the safety and welfare of the victim. The criminal charges that resulted from the expanded investigation included computer fraud, cyberstalking, conspiracy to violate civil rights,
and systematic harassment under federal anti-stalking statute. The combination of charges created potential sentences that would ensure Ryan's incarceration for most of his remaining professional career, effectively ending any possibility of his return to positions where he could abuse other employees. The trial that followed provided a public forum for exposing the full scope of Ryan's systematic cruelty and the corporate culture at Summit Solutions that had enabled his abuse of colleagues and subordinates. The testimony from dozens of victims created a comprehensive picture of systematic psychological torture that had been conducted with the apparent approval and support of the company's executive leadership. Jessica's testimony as the primary victim of Ryan's harassment campaign was particularly powerful because her subsequent success at Pinnacle demonstrated the professional capabilities that Summit Solutions had sought to destroy through their systematic abuse. The contrast between her current achievements and the desperate circumstances created by Ryan's sabotage campaign illustrated the enormous human cost of corporate psychopathy and systematic employment abuse. Ryan Thompson's harassment campaign was designed not just to eliminate competition for his own advancement, but to systematically destroy the lives and careers of talented professionals who posed no threat to his position. Jessica testified during the federal trial. The evidence shows that he took personal pleasure in documenting our struggles and celebrating our failures, revealing a level of psychological cruelty that has no place in any professional environment. The federal jury's verdict reflected their horror at the systematic nature of Ryan's abuse and the corporate culture that had enabled his crimes against former colleagues. The guilty verdicts on all counts ensured that Ryan would face decades of imprisonment while also creating legal precedents that would facilitate prosecution of similar cases in other jurisdictions. The sentence that followed exceeded even the prosecutor's recommendations, as the federal judge expressed outrage at the systematic nature of the abuse and the devastating impact on the victims' lives and career. The 40-year federal prison sentence effectively ended Ryan's life outside of correctional institutions, while sending a clear message about the serious consequences of systematic workplace harassment and abuse. Mr. Thompson's crimes represent a particularly heinous form of corporate abuse that strikes at the heart of American workers' fundamental rights to seek employment without fear of systematic harassment and sabotage, the federal judge stated during the sentencing hearing. The systematic nature of his crimes and the pleasure he apparently took in documenting his victims' suffering warrant the maximum possible sentence under federal guidelines. The civil settlements that accompanied the criminal convictions provided substantial financial compensation for all the victims of Ryan's harassment campaign, while also funding ongoing monitoring programs to prevent similar abuse in other corporate environments. The financial penalties imposed on Summit Solutions' former executives created additional deterrent effects that would discourage other companies from implementing similar systematic abuse programs. Jessica's role in exposing and prosecuting the extended harassment campaign had elevated her status within the employment law community to that of a national expert on corporate abuse prevention and victim advocacy. The consulting practice she had built around these issues was generating requests from companies throughout the United States who sought to implement ethical employment practices that would prevent similar scandals. The personal healing that accompanied the complete legal vindication and Ryan's imprisonment was profound and transformative for Jessica, finally allowing her to process the emotional trauma of his betrayal without the ongoing stress of continued harassment and sabotage. The knowledge that he would spend the rest of his professional life in federal prison provided a sense of closure that enabled her to focus entirely on building positive relationships and meaningful work. The romantic relationship that Jessica eventually developed with Marcus William, a fellow employment attorney who had worked on the prosecution team, was built on a foundation of mutual respect and shared values that contrasted dramatically with the manipulation and exploitation that had characterized her involvement with Ryan. The healthy relationship demonstrated how much she had grown emotionally and psychologically through the process of surviving and overcoming systematic abuse. The wedding that took place 2 years after Ryan's conviction was attended by dozens of former Summit Solutions employees, who had found new careers and renewed hope through Pinnacle's ethical employment practices and the legal remedies that had provided both financial compensation and public vindication. The celebration represented not just personal happiness for Jessica, but collective triumph over the systematic abuse that had once seemed insurmountable. The foundation that Jessica and Marcus established to support victims of corporate harassment and employment abuse had already assisted more than 500 professionals in pursuing legal remedies and finding new career opportunities after being targeted by systematic termination schemes.